See how many people. Just have 16 people right now. Just wait for the rest to turn up. Everybody here? You're about half the class already. We'll just wait for a few more. Thirty-five people now. I'll start when it reaches 40. Let's see. All right, we've reached 40 people. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum. We're going to be discussing about single and double loop learning today. Mainly the work is based on Argyris and Schön's work about how people learn within the context of their organization. So what do we mean by single and double loop learning? So when we look at how individuals learn, and these are individuals in organizations, right? So when people learn, they construct and then they test and restructure, right? The knowledge and information that they have. So we've gone through that the last time when we looked at Nonaka's learning, right? How we construct learning in the organization from the individual to teams, to organization, and later on to a global level. And also, we've looked at how knowledge is transformed, right, within social learning and externalism, externalization and internalization. And also, when we look into how knowledge remains at a tacit level. So that tacit and explicit interchange of knowledge is also something that we consider when we look into how knowledge is transferred from individuals to another individual and the individual to the teams and also so forth in the organization, right? So that is basically how we look at individual learning. And then in terms of organization learning, organization is not just merely a collection of individuals. It's not just about people within an organization, because just having a lot of people within the organization, there's not just individuals, but there are also teams and also systems. And within each of those teams and systems also, there are interchange of knowledge. People learn in a social setting. And as such, individuals, teams, and also within the organization, there are certain ways that they learn. So it's just not about individual learning, but it's about learning through the experience and actions of individuals. And these would include teams and when they come together as an organization. So remember, whenever we learn within an organization, it's not just about individuals learning about something. They may learn how to do their work. They may learn how to interact with each other. They may learn about the subject matter, right? They may learn about the processes within the organization. But that is just the individuals learning something. Then we also have the teams who learn from each other and teams that learn from another team, right? And then there are also the organization, which is made up of systems. And we have emphasized in the past that, yes, when we, for example, embed learning, when we document learning, then that learning is also part of systems learning. So the organization is always made up of all this, and learning happens at all these different levels. Okay, so as such, we shall accept that organization learning is not the same as individual learning, right? So organization learning is more than just individuals learning. This one that somehow. All right. So an organization is an organization when decisions are made collectively, right? So as long as individuals make their own decisions, as long as individuals unilaterally decide on what they do and do not depend on each other. So whenever there is no interdependence, then it is not an organization. That is the first thing that we have established in the definition of an organization, where two or more people are interdependent of each other. And that is what an organization must be, right? So as such, when decisions are made, they must be made collectively. There's no such thing as unilateral. There's no such thing as just one person making decision. Although, yes, you may have the leader making the decisions, but the decision is actually based on the benefit of the organization. And also delegation of authority, because that is one of the organization vertical structure, delegation, right? And as such, there are always a delegation of authority to individuals, looking into the vertical structure of the organization. And then also there are boundaries between collectivity within the organization and at the global level, which is outside the organization. So an organization has a clear boundary. It spells out the boundary of the organization, where the organization ends and where the global level, or where the where we have the environment begins, right? And as such, you see that that boundary is semi-permeable. Although there is a boundary, it is semi-permeable in which the environment may affect the organization. So these are the assumptions when we look into the single loop and also the double loop learning, right? Number one, we must understand what an organization is. It is a collective, collaborative group of people working together. And then number two, they are interdependent. They rely on each other to achieve a certain goal. And then also the organization has a boundary which separates it from the environment. So you may want to look into both the works of Argyris and Schön, right? These are the two scholars that comes up with the learning, especially when we talk about single loop and double loop learning, right? And as such, what Schön assumes is that there is no stable state, right? There's no such thing as something that doesn't move at all. In every organization, they change all the time, right? So, for example, we may look at the staff or employees. The number of employees may change all the time, right? Decisions change all the time. Policies change all the time. Procedures and processes change all the time. And as such, it is not just something that is permanent. It is not stable, but what we call quasi-stability, right? So there is a certain state of disequilibrium, right? What they say as quasi-equilibrium state, QUASI, meaning that although there is a apparent stability, but when you look at it, it actually changes all the time. So an organization is always dynamic, right? So when an organization is dynamic, it, in a sense, is always affected by the environment outside the organization. So if there is an economic change outside, then the organization will be affected. If there is a political change, technological change, all these are actually things that may affect the organization, right? Well, a very good example in which we have experienced and which we have lived in recently is the COVID-19, right? So this is a pandemic that in such a way has affected the organization tremendously, right? We see that organizations have to close for a certain period of time and are now starting to reopen and begin to operate. But still, as a result of the pandemic, organizations will not be able to operate as they were before the pandemic. So in such a situation, we have seen that the environment of the organization has an impact, has influenced the organization's operations, right? And this will go on, although we see that it is a change, but that change in itself will continue to change as it is dynamic. We will see standard operation procedures, for example, being introduced. And those standard operation procedures, although they are saying as standard, they may change over time to suit the requirement of controlling the pandemic, right? So as soon as we are better able to understand the coronavirus and the resultant COVID-19, then we will have certain changes that we make, right? So for example, in the past, right, we may have put a lot of belief that surface areas of equipment, for example, may house the virus dead for a certain period of time. And recent information have indicated that, well, maybe we are not as easily infected by surface contacts, right? But right now, what we have established is that, yes, whenever someone sneezes or someone coughs, then the water droplets or particles of water may be the main infectants for COVID-19. And as such, we have decided that, for example, masks would be a good way to prevent infection. So this is something that will be ongoing and probably will be changing according to what we know about COVID-19, right? So as such, the dynamic nature of the knowledge of the information that we have about the pandemic will continue to affect how we think, what we believe about preventing the disease, right? So the requirement for organization learning is not just a one-time occurrence, right? It is not just a simple phenomenon that happens at one time and sporadic in a sense that it is somewhat predictable. We can anticipate changes, right? So knowing that, for example, in terms of fuel costs for the organizations, we know that fuel or power will change. Either it gets cheaper or it will get more expensive, right? Technology will continue to change. So what technology we are using right now is just something that is not going to be permanent. It may be suitable for now, but we will continue to change, right? The way that we do things, we may have, for example, emphasize a lot on the brick and mortar setup, where we have outlets that actually sells our products. But as we see right now, it is already beginning to change on a much more online type of business. And we may invest a lot on online businesses. We may invest in hardware. We may invest in software. But then again, it works for now, right? In the future, it may be different, right? So we will continue to change the way that we do, the change that we operate within the organization, right? All right. How does the organization learn? Well, we for today are going to look into two ways of learning. Basically, the single loop learning and the double loop learning. We will also later on look into what we call deutero learning, or some would say as triple loop learning. But for today, we are going to emphasize on just single loop learning and double loop learning. Now, the term itself, single loop and double loop, may reflect the way, the processes that we go through when we learn to learn about something, right? So later on, we'll go into deutero learning. So how does one begin to develop a mental map, right? What is a mental map? A mental map is simply how we view things, how we view the world that we are living in. Right. So in everyone's mental map, according to Schön, right, it spells out how someone acts in any particular situation, right? So someone may plan and then they may implement and then they may reflect on what they did. So that is quite common in this process of learning. We try to plan something and then we do it, which is an implementation stage. And then after doing it, we try to reflect or review it. These are most common in terms of how we react in situations, right? For example, how do we deal with irate customers, customers who are upset, customers who are disappointed? We may have developed a certain mental map on what we need to do when a customer gets upset, right? So the normal way, for example, the standard operating procedure is, for example, number one is to just calm down the person. And then to calm down, there may be certain ways of doing that. And each organization would have its own way of doing certain things, right? So calm down the person and then agree to what they have to say and propose some other options, all right? So these are all within the standard way that organizations would act in certain situation, right? So each organization would have its own processes and procedures in ensuring that their operations can be done as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And these are the procedures which are based on the mental maps of the organization on how they deal with the everyday occurrences at the organization. How do they make a purchase, for example, so that they won't get cheated? There are certain ways, right? So organizations have ways of dealing with things, right? Everyday work, how do they, for example, recruit personnel? How do they hire? And how do they fire employees? So all these are within a certain operation procedure based on the requirements of the law, based on the requirements of the organization, based on what the organization is able to do, right? So overall, these are the maps that guides the actions of individuals within the organizations, right? And then there are later on, we will talk about theories in use and espouse theory, but later on, right? For now, we just look into how people would normally react. You can even ask yourself, when given an assignment, what do you do, right? When you are going to sit down for an examination, what do you do? That is actually your mental map in approaching a certain task on how you would act given a certain situation, right? Just simple things, for example, our mental maps have changed in the way how we conduct classes, right? In the past, whenever we schedule a class, just like today, for example, we have a class at 12. So we would convene at an agreed location, and then class would begin by having me asking questions, and then we will go on to discuss about things, and we would discuss about the subject matter, and there would be slides that are presented. These are the mental maps of how classes are conducted in the past, right? There is interaction in the class where we have face-to-face interactions. But all these have changed in the way that we are doing a much more online class right now. How do we plan for online class? I have to schedule the class using a particular software. And in this case, I am choosing Zoom meeting, for example. And I schedule the class. After I schedule the class, I use WhatsApp invitation for the class members so that people will know how they can actually register or log on into the meeting. And once they are logged on, then we can actually begin our classes. And the classes that we have now is very much different from the classes that we have in the past, right? For example, right now, there's not much interaction, right? Just me talking, and then what I'm faced is just blank screens. So there are no interactions. I don't ask any questions because I don't see any faces, right? And I'm not moved or not motivated to point out to someone because I know probably in some of those names are just names, but the person are not, the person is probably not there, right? So this is the current state of online learning. But this, again, may change in the future. Remember, it is always a dynamic process in which the future may not necessarily be what we anticipate. For the moment, this is how we conduct class, and we have actually built a mental map of how an online class would proceed. And that is the mental map that we have, right? But then there are theories about learning, right? So online learning, the university, and also there are theories about how we can conduct online learning. But when it comes to the real thing, then we probably act the best in the best way that suits the requirement of the situation. So as such, the theories may not match what we do, right? It's the same thing, right? If you want to go out now, what do you have to do? You want to go to the supermarket, for example, or you want to go to any departmental store or outlet, right? You have to go there, you have to put on a mask, and then you have to scan. After scanning, you will fill in your particulars, and after that, you get your temperature, put in the temperature, and then record the temperature, and then you may go into the store, right? Now, that would probably fit the mental map or standard operations requirement. But that does not necessarily mean that it will be done at all times, right? Suddenly there may be an influx of people, there may be too many people to handle, and as such, the store may want to change their operations procedure, right? So these are things where, for example, the theory, espoused theory, what is to be done, and the theory in use, what is actually done, may be different, right? So what we plan out to do, no matter how well we have documented and how well we have planned a certain process, but when it comes to the real thing, other things may happen, right? We may plan to go to Kuala Lumpur at a certain time, at a certain day for a certain meeting at a certain time. But then suddenly there is a jam, traffic jam. Then you may have to change things around, right? So as such, your plan, which is what you call the theory, espoused theory, the plan what you plan to do, right, may not work out as it had been planned, but you would then resort to theory in use. As such, espoused theory and theory in use may not be the same, right? So as a result, they say that there is a difference between theory and action. And you know this all the time, right? You may plan certain strategies for those who play games, for example, football, play tennis. You have a certain game strategy. But when it comes to the real things, you may refine or retune your strategy to fit that situation. And as such, this is an example where the espoused theory and the theory in use, what you end up doing, may differ from each other. So this is what it means by espoused theory and theory in use. So espoused theory is a theory that gives allegiance to communicate what you actually tell others what you want to do, right? What the standard operation procedures are. So that would be the espoused theory, right? The espoused theory for this class, okay, we are going to meet at 12. And then suddenly there is a power outage. There was a power disruption. So the theory in use would then change, right? Look at how the semester has gone. We have actually planned to have the semester end about now. But suddenly, with the MCO, movement control order, and somehow we have to replan, and then we have what we have now, an extended semester. Not only in an extended semester, but the way we do things have also changed entirely. The way we sit for exams may change, right? We have yet to discuss how we are going to sit for our exam for this class, but it's more likely going to be an online exam and something that I would need to configure out, right? So these are the changes in terms of theory in use. Yes, we are going to do the exam this way, but when it comes to actual doing of the exam, then it might not entirely be the same as the one that we have planned. So the espoused theory and the theory in use, what we actually do, right? So theory in use is actually what we do, what we act, so that it can actually match the situation. It can be suited to a certain situation that has developed. Although we have planned differently, we may end up doing something entirely different, right? So just remember, espoused theory is what we actually plan to do, and theory in use, what actually happened, what we actually did in this particular situation, all right? So in any theory, there are governing, what they call governing variables, right? So governing variables are those things that are taken into account. For example, the resources that we have. How many people or how many employees are working for us? That would be a governing variable. How much time do we have? What are the learning materials that we have? What are the technologies that we have? So those are actually governing variables. And the governing variables actually spells out our plans, our strategies on what we need to do. And as such, those governing variables will also determine our action strategies. So these two elements, the governing variables and the action strategies, will determine the espoused theory, right? So, and also we take into account the consequences, because what we do, what we plan to do, we plan for certain outcomes, and those are the consequences. And these are the three things that matters in both espoused theory, and also theory in use. Quick. Sorry.
Quick.
Any questions out there? Is everyone clear on espoused theory and theory in use?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, doctor.
Any questions? All right.
No.
So far, okay, doctor.
I can't actually hear people. The volume is full.
Clear, doctor.
Yes. Should we
Okay.
continue now? Everything okay? All
Yes,
right.
doctor.
Okay. In terms of governing variables, right? So governing variables, they say here, are those dimensions that people are trying to keep with acceptable limits. Acceptable limits of actions, acceptable limits of expectations and anticipations, right? So these are the governing variables, right? What we are trying to keep within acceptable limit. And then there are action strategies, what we intend to do, the plans and the actions that we want to do in order to achieve an outcome. And then there are the consequences as a result of what we do, putting together the governing variables and also the acts that we did, then there is a certain expected outcome. Take into account or take into consideration this class, right? So in this class, for example, right now, we have online classes. And the governing variables are things like, for example, what kind of technology do you have when we want to conduct online learning, right? So we have decided, for example, to use Zoom meeting, right? So there are acceptable limits within Zoom meeting that we have to actually have a meeting at a certain particular time of day. So we have to schedule it, right? And then as a result of scheduling a meeting, we have decided to convene the meeting at a certain time, right? And how do we conduct the meeting? We as for me, I plan, for example, to have a slide that is going to be presented, and then I am going to present that slide in terms of the discussions that I have, right? So those are the limits of what I can do. Action strategies goes on how I am going to conduct the class, right? So at 12, I'm going to begin the class. I'm going to put on a slideshow with a certain subject matter to be discussed, and I will present them, right? So right now, I probably do not have any question and answers because for now, Zoom does not allow me to actually see people so that I can actually point out to certain people and have a discussion. We have had discussion in class where we had face-to-face meeting, and you can actually see that it is a different approach in how we conduct our teaching learning exercises. And doing online is possibly very much different from having a face-to-face interaction. So each of those teaching and learning methods that we have adopted is based on what technologies we have and what kind of resources that we have within ourselves, so that that would in a way spell out how we are going to act out in the in teaching and learning. And of course, we expect different consequences, right? So the consequence of having a much more direct face-to-face learning will be much more, to me, effective and much more efficient way of learning, rather than just having an online class using Zoom technology, where I don't even see the faces of my students, where most of the class is conducted just with me presenting and delivering the subject matter, right? So even when I ask questions, there are very few responses. Somehow, Zoom technology does not allow us to have a lot of interaction, right? I may use a lot of interaction, but we will see later on as this further develops, we may get better at using this technology, right? So consequences is actually what happens as a result of an action. All right. And the basis of much of Argyris, this slide, I think, when you retrieve the slide from our Putra Blast, I've uploaded it on Putra Blast. Have you seen it on Putra Blast? People, have you looked at the slide on Putra Blast? If you retrieve it on Putra Blast, you may adjust the setting here, especially this part, so that the words. I think you may want to use other color for the font so that it becomes much more evident. Because right now white on this doesn't actually work. But never mind. So what this says is basis for Argyris. Yes, yes, Mani. Anything?
Doktor,
Yes.
Zoom recording ni doktor tak upload dalam Putra Blast eh?
Or the last one, yeah. But this one, I think, yeah, I'll be loading it later on. I think the last two classes tak ada ya?
Tak ada rasanya.
Tak ada ya? Okay.
Ada sound je.
I'll look into it. Probably there's been some technological uncertainty. All right, anyway. What Argyris proposed is that learning is composed of finding an error, right? Usually we do things and then we may do things differently, right? Or we may make mistakes while doing it. What is important in learning is that we are able to identify what happened, what was the mistake, and how to correct the error, right? So it is, for example, one way is that when we play a game, for example, when we play football, right? Then we make mistakes and the opponent scores. When we play netball, we forgot or we moved out of position, and as such, the opponent can score easily. So we have actually identified the error. What was wrong? And then we find ways to actually correct the error so that it doesn't happen again, right? So very much when we talk about learning, this is how it happens. And as time goes on, we begin to improve the way that we do things. And it goes the same way in most organizations when they produce something, right? For example, my daughter is making cakes, right? So at one moment, she may have added too much water onto the flour. So the cake doesn't come out like what it intended to be. So if the error is identified, next time she will reduce the amount of water to take into account that flour is already much more damp in a humid climate. There is a higher moisture content in the flour in Malaysia than the one in the recipe that is based on a much more drier situation or much more drier environment. So those are the things, for example, if we are able to detect the error and we are able to make adjustments in order to correct the error. And if we notice most of the times that we learn something, we do by correcting errors. There is such a thing as trial and error. We try out things, and then as mistakes happen, we correct those mistakes. And as such, we get better at doing something. The same thing, for example, driving a car. As you learn how to drive a car, you probably make mistakes. And those mistakes are identified and you get better, right? For example, those people who learn how to drive using a gear shift, When you want to change gears, for example, right? You may change wrongly, and then the next time you improve on the way that you change your gears, right? And that is how a lot of learning happens. And Argyris has identified it as correcting errors, identifying and correcting errors as we get along, right? So the theory about learning is that we solve problem by correcting errors, correcting our mistakes, identify our mistakes, and making corrections to those mistakes that we make, right? So many people look for another strategy that will address and work within governing variables. Remember what governing variables are? Governing variables include the plans that we have. And as such, there is such a thing as single loop and double looped learning, which we will look in detail as what they are, right? So in single loop learning, when something goes wrong, people search for another strategy that will correct and work within the governing variables. Take, for example, that you lose a customer and you want to find out what actually happened. So you lose a customer because you did not provide good service. So as a correction, you improve your after-sales service, right? So this is probably identifying the mistakes and then correcting the mistake so that we have a better way and a better outcome as a result of the mistake having been corrected, right? You look at a lot of things. For example, when you hand in assignments, you get first time, right? You may get poor marks, and in the end, you identify together with, for example, the instructor, that the reason for you getting poor mark is that you did not use enough references in your assignments, right? And as such, what do? You begin to use more references. Now, you have identified what was the mistake that got you low marks in the first assignment, and in the second assignment, you improve the assignment by adding more reference, and as such, yes, it works, right? Now, that would very much be an example of a single loop learning, where you identify what was lacking, you identify the shortfall or the mistakes, and you correct that mistake. A good example of a single loop learning, right? So as such, single loop learning is like a thermostat. You know what a thermostat is? When you have the air condition, you adjust the temperature, how cold it is, how warm it is. And then as you adjust, you put in 24, right? 24, you find it being too hot because there are too many people in the room. So as such, because it's too hot, you lower the temperature. You probably put it as 20. And then you suddenly find that 20 is too cold. And then you increase the temperature, the thermostat temperature to, for example, 22. And this probably gives you a much more comfortable environment, right? So in this case, a single loop learning identifies what is not evident or what is not correct, what is not right within the situation. And we correct that particular situation, right? So, for example, if there is people in an organization, for example, people turning up late for work, right? So turning up late for work has been identified as a problem, right? Why do people turn up late at work? Because they start off work too late, right? So they have to be at their work at 8 o'clock. They leave their house at 7 o'clock, and this does not give them adequate time to reach the office at 8 o'clock. So a single loop learning, right? You know what your mistake is. You started off too late at 7. You improved it by, okay, we will leave at 6:45. And when you leave at 6:45, you find out that you are able to reach the workplace on time at 8 o'clock. That is very much a single loop learning. All right? Now, how does a single loop learning differ from a double loop learning? Right? So, while a single loop learning looks at a particular mistake, at a particular shortfall, at a particular drawback, the double loop learning goes one step further to the back. It looks at the assumptions behind, right? For example, if arriving late at 8 o'clock to work is the problem, people arriving late. Now, a single loop learning will look at why that happens, and as such, you identify the shortcoming and you make changes to what the mistake was. How would a double loop learning differ from that single loop learning? Now, the double loop learning will look at the assumptions behind the requirements, the assumptions behind the problem, right? Because you say that you should be at work at 8 o'clock. And that is the assumption behind that. Now, a double loop learning would then question, why should it be at 8 o'clock? Because you assume that 8 o'clock is the specified time to be at work. So a double loop learning doesn't look at why you don't arrive at 8 o'clock, but you may want to look at why should it be 8 o'clock? Why not 8:15? And as such, a double loop learning may come up with a different solution to solving the problem, right? So for double loop learning, the 8 o'clock is an assumption that you have to be at work. And as such, in a double loop learning, you begin to question, why should it be at 8? Why can't it be at 7:30? Why can't it be at 8:15? Why can it be at a certain time? So you would probably, rather than having a particular time of coming to work, then you may resort to flexi time. You may come to work whatever time you want, as long as you put in the amount of hours that you need to work, right? But then again, that might not work every time, because your customers may come at 8, and so you begin to find other solutions. You anticipate what could be the problem, and as such, you may have certain people who arrive, who are already there, who must be there at 8, and these people can leave earlier, while other people who have not been identified as being critical at that time, to be present at that time, may come at other times. So in a way, the double loop learning does not correct the mistake. It looks at the assumption of the cause of the problem, right? So that is the difference between a single loop learning and a double loop learning, right? So basically what happens is that to Argyris, the double loop learning is important in that it makes better decisions, that you actually know what the real problem is, rather than having the problem of you starting off late to work. He says that why should you look at that particular time to be the requirement for you to be at work, and questions the assumptions behind the time you have to be at work. All right? So this is how it would look like when you want to look into policies, plan, the outcome, right? That is intended. If the outcome is to be at work at 8 o'clock, the single loop learning just looks at the action. What you need to do to be able to reach the office by 8 o'clock, right? So in other words, it just looks at the action, what you need to do. So if you come in at 8:15, for example, it's because you started off too late, then correcting the action, you will have to set off to work or leave home much earlier. And that in a way also solves the problem, which is intended for you to come at 8 o'clock, right? But in a double loop learning, it goes back, right? So the outcome that you want is people coming at work at 8 o'clock. But in a double loop learning, you begin to question the policies, plans, and values. For example, why do we need to come to work at 8 o'clock? Why can't it be 8:15? Why can't it be 8:30? Right? Because what is important is that you do a certain amount of work at a certain time, right? And then you say, oh, wait, customers do come in at 8 o'clock, and we make then changes for those, right, who have to be there. If there is requirement, then we have a certain number of people who would probably come to work at 8 a.m. So what happens is that we have a much more comprehensive solution to our problems rather than just having a single loop. We combine both single loop and double loop learning. That makes it much more suitable, right? So the same thing, for example, if your organization is experiencing a lot of overtime, right? So right now we say overtime is not necessary because overtime increases cost. It increases the cost in salary, right? To make up the payments for people having to work extra time. It also has an additional cost in the resources, especially, for example, in the electricity bill, in the security costs, for example. And as such, you begin to question, do we actually need for people to come to do overtime? That would be a much more double loop learning. A single loop learning is that you may look at why do people have to work overtime. You may find out, well, they were actually assigned too much work. So you actually plan work so that a much more equitable amount of work is given to people. You begin to reorganize work so that it becomes adequate for people to complete the work within their working hours, right? So you have certain requirements and procedures on how work should be done, right? So basically, you may look at any problems. So if the problem requires a solution at the action level, then it's probably a single loop learning. But at the same time, you may question the assumptions behind the problem. You may want to review policies, the plans, and the values behind the problem. And that would constitute more as a double loop learning. Okay? All right. I think I will continue today because apart from double loop learning, something that is more similar, that is very much similar to double loop learning is what you would call action science, right? So basically, action science deals with model 1 and model 2 behaviors, right? So simply say, Argyris and Schön continued to develop their methods, and in the end, they came up with what they say they term as model 1 behavior and model 2 behavior, right? Model 1 behavior is actually designed to inhibit double loop learning, while model 2 behavior is actually enhances double loop learning. Now, let's see what model 1 and model 2 behavior is all about, right? According to Argyris and Schön, model 1 behavior control the task and the environment, right? The whole purpose of it is to have a much more controlled environment of working, where things are much more specified and defined. There are certain procedures and processes that need to be adhered to, that needs to be followed strictly in order for the work to be done as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So the whole idea is so that you actually have a better way of doing that. And as such, you will not get into trouble because you follow specific processes, specific procedures, and as long as you follow the procedures, then you cannot be wrong. What is wrong as the procedures, right? For example, if you want to purchase an equipment, right? We have certain purchasing requirements and processes. And if you were to follow that processes, then you cannot be faulted because you have actually followed due processes. The same thing, pilots, right? And any work, doctors, professionals, they all have their processes and procedures. As long as they follow those processes and procedures, then they cannot be faulted if something goes wrong. So in other words, model 1 protects self and others, protects everyone who actually follows the procedures. You will only be wrong, you will be only at fault if you do not follow procedures, right? So what happens is that, for example, right now we have standard operating procedures, right? We have, for example, our ISO 9000. We have our ISO 9000 in teaching. We have to plan, and then we follow the plan, and as long as you follow the plan, what you have planned, you will be okay. Even if something goes wrong, then you are not at fault because you have already followed procedures. What happens is that all these procedures, you are following certain processes, actually inhibits inquiries and treating one's own view as correct. What happens here is that you do not look for other possibilities or better ways of doing the work. You are doing something just because you fear of making mistakes. But to be much more innovative at the same time, if you want to have a better way of doing things, if you want to continue to be innovative at work, if you want to get better results, doing the same things may not be able to guarantee you better results, because having standard procedures ensures that something comes out the same all the time, right? If you were to study the same way that you have studied in the past, right, and if you got B's for that, you probably will not be able to get A's if you just follow the same procedures, right? Because the understanding now is that you will not be able to get better results if you continue to be doing the same things, That is what we believe nowadays, right? For that, that is actually what Model 1 is all about. Doing the same things over and over again just because you want to get similar results. So in conclusion, when you have Model 1 is always about following processes, following certain procedures that are standard. And as long as you follow those standards, you cannot go wrong, even if you do not get better results. But because you follow procedures, getting the same result is not wrong, right? So you cannot be wrong if you follow the same procedure. But what happens is that doing the same things may not be innovative, and as such may not yield better results. So that will be Model 1. Then Model 2 will be something that is much more different, where you actually can actually make changes based on the assumptions behind doing things. So this is a particular way of teaching. To teach, you must have a plan, a teaching plan. And you follow that teaching plan as it has been outlined. And as such, you cannot go wrong. The students will learn. That is the assumption, right? But in Model 2 behavior, we know that things change all the time, right? In fact, probably by doing online teaching and learning, we would probably be going against ISO 9000 if it has not in any way allowed for online teaching, right? But our ISO 9000, yes, we have made ways. That's why we have Putra Blast. We have actually made allowances for online learning, and as such, we will not be faulted, or we will not be going against ISO 9000. But in other instances, in a very dynamic way, in a very dynamic world, for example, in the world of business, in the world of oil and gas, right? Things may need to change. Things may need to change. We may need to change the way that we do things. And then when we change the way that we do things, we will probably get better results out of what we have done. We may get bigger profits if, for example, we change things. So Model 2 behavior is different from Model 1 behavior is that it does not stick to any particular processes or procedures. There are actually ways that we do things to how that we can be much more innovative, right? And as such, to be much more innovative, most importantly is that we get people to contribute. We get people to actually reflect on what they did and change according to the situation. They reflect, they assess and evaluate, and as such, they actually make changes to the way. So basically, in Model 2 behavior, people have more choice of doing things differently, right? And as such, this would increase the possibility of double loop learning simply because you are questioning the assumptions, right? You may be questioning the obvious. Why are we still doing this the same way that we have been doing it in the past, right? Our plantation industry have been using the estate approach in producing palm oil. Is that the best way to do it, for example? So we begin to question. We have always, for example, harvested paddy after 3 months. What if we harvested it a little bit sooner? Then they say, oh wait, if it is a little bit sooner, then the paddy will not be ripe, will not ripe. But that is because it is based on certain environmental conditions, right? What if we increase the light source, right? The amount of light in a day. then probably we get better yield or higher yield. But that is actually changes that we have, right? Precision agriculture, using drones to fertilize, all those actually changes, right? We are having disruptive technology that are making changes nowadays in the way that we work. So those things must be taken into account.
கடவுளே.
Yes. So what is organization learning? Now, in
Alhamdulillah.
organization learning, what needed to be done is that each worker or each employee would look into their own theory in use, how they actually do things, right? We have espoused theory, the way we are supposed to do things, but the way that we are supposed to do things can be questioned. They can be changed in model to behavior. They can be changed in double loop learning. So you don't necessarily have to follow the espoused theory, but look at your theory in use. What you actually did, does it increase? So an organization, in the learning organization, the worker or the employee or the individual would be given much more leeway in deciding what they need to do, right? They have much more freedom in doing the work that they want to do. So I was, for example, giving Google as an example. Google does not do things the way that most organizations do. They do not specify what work each employee needs to do, but the employee decides for himself or herself how they are going to do the work. And as such, they are given much more freedom of doing the work. But you must understand that not all organizations are like Google, where they have much more freedom in developing their products. In manufacturing, for example, there must be certain ways of doing things. When you want to produce a car, there has to be a standard process. But within each of those standard processes, there may be changes. And that is why, for example, organizations may have their own quality circles, groups of people who look at the work that they did, how they did their work, and come up with better ways of doing the work. So in such a way, work and the way they work, the processes that they have becomes much more innovative. And as such, the organization also becomes much more innovative, right? So within a certain environment within the organization, you can actually make changes so that you can improve the way that the organization does the work, right? So how do you convert organizations into learning organizations? This is what Argyris suggested, how organizations can move from a single loop learning to a double loop learning. Number one, mapping the problem. You have to look at the problem much more comprehensively, not just what happened, right? Remember, in single loop learning, we look at why the problem happens because of the action. But in double loop learning, you begin to look at the problem in much more holistic, much more comprehensive way, in that you look behind the assumptions of the problem. Why must it be 8 o'clock, for example, right? And then after you have mapped out what actually is the problem, what causes the problem, what are the assumptions behind the problem, what are the expectations and anticipations of people with the problem, then you may have a clearer idea of the problem. And then internalize the map in which people begin to think about it, right? What they need to do in order for the problem to have a better outcome, right? And number three, you come up with different processes and test out the model. Are there better ways of solving the problems? Are there better ways of doing work so that you can get better consequences or better outcomes to the problem, right? And when you do that, when you have tested, then you invent solutions, a better way of doing, and then you implement the solution and then look at what happens, right? Because yes, there will be a different outcome, there will be different consequences, but you must also remember there may be other side effects to the intervention. And these also must be taken into account because they are part of the comprehensive solution to the problem. All right? So we have just now introduced what neutral learning is all about. Now, neutral learning is in the sense that the organization can restructure itself. Remember, it is a dynamic environment. And as such, organizations may be required to restructure itself, to exploit new technologies, or in order for it to address certain problems that have come up within the environment. So if we were to ask ourselves, how have organizations changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? It is a good example into looking at neutral learning in the sense that organizations are now beginning to restructure itself in light of social distancing, in light of masking, and in light of having much more hygienic ways, much more sanitized ways of doing work, right? So those three requirements probably change the way that we look at things, right? For now, for example, UPM, in fact, in Malaysia, all higher learning institutions are not going to have face-to-face interactions until the end of the year. We'll be using online learning. But you see, right now, this is probably the best way that we have for the moment of conducting online learning. But as we go on, we begin to reflect, we begin to review the processes of online learning, we will come up with better solutions so that we can improve the outcomes of our teaching and learning exercise when we use online learning. Right? So very important is that we continue to reflect on the way that we do things and we question the way that we do things, right? So there is, for example, we have in the past, in fact, right now, most of the online learning has a lot of the structures of face-to-face learning, right? This may change in the future where we have, for example, a freedom for students to do whatever they want in order to achieve. Maybe in the future, we will just have student presentations on the topics that have been decided by the class on what they need to learn in any particular course. So in the future, to prevent just me taking on the dominant role of in teaching and learning, then we may change the way that we teach and learn in the sense that in the future, students will play a much more active role in classes during online learning, right? We may not ever go back to face-to-face. We don't know. Or we have a certain way to have limited face-to-face learning, right? So all this will be based on how we look and we continue to evaluate our teaching and learning context, plans, and outcomes. Right? So again, we begin to question the way. The same thing that organizations, the way that they do things in the past. Is it the best way to do things? Or is there a better way? And in light of the pandemic, I think what the pandemic has done is that it has forced organizations to quickly reflect on the way that they do things and come up with much more innovative ways of delivering their products or delivering their services to their customers, right? And there will be an organization learning curve because the curve is that performance will be going down, right? The curve, whenever there's a new way of doing things, your performance, your outcome, your results will go down because this is the time where people learn to do new things. As they get better at doing things the new way, then their performance will increase, and as such, the results will also be improved in the future. So this is the organization learning curve. And what is it about neutral learning? Well, neutral learning, what they did is that it facilitates, whether we want to question, does it facilitate or inhibit learning? Is it good for learning or is it bad for learning? So when we look, for example, at the learning curve, how far do we fall? How much is performance expected to decrease, right? Is the decrease in performance in any way going to affect the organizations adversely to such a point that it will be losing most of its customers? So these are things that we must continue to look at when we consider neutral learning. But there will always be new strategies, right? As a result of COVID-19, we will have new ways of doing things. We have new ways of conducting classes. We have new ways of assessing our students. And it may be different from the past of what we've known with that. And the same thing goes for organizations. The way that they deliver their services, the way that they sell the products may also be different. The way that they market. These are all things that we, right, fortunately, will be part of the transformation simply because we have been forced to do it in a new way, right? So this will result in new strategies. As of now, we see that yes, people have lost jobs. People have been out of employment, and these people are learning to do new things, right? They are relearning, they are retooling themselves in order for them to do, for example, a new economy that probably does not do the things that the old economy does. So there'll be new strategies of doing things, right? And they begin to continue to assess what they need to do, right? And what they are able to get as a result of the new ways of doing things, right? And this will be reflected. People will have a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching work, right? And this, in a result, will come up with new mental maps. The way that we do things, the way that we learn to do new things, the way that we begin to have established procedures and processes of doing things, right? And then we also begin to inquire into looking at the past so that we have a more informed decision on what we need to do next. All right? So that will be the class for today. What we need to discuss is about single loop learning and double loop learning. And remember, also model 1 behavior that actually is similar to single loop learning in the sense that it probably inhibits double loop learning. And then we have model 2 behavior, in which way it actually helps double loop learning. Any questions? So hopefully I'll be able to upload this recording onto Putra Blast later on today. So that will be the end of our class for today. Any questions, anyone? I don't see any faces at all.
No question, Doctor.
No questions?
Yes, I do understand.
Okay. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to refer to me on the WhatsApp. So far, I've not had any questions either on WhatsApp or on email. But feel free. I know this is difficult, especially when we do not have a much more open face-to-face interaction. But go on. Just don't depend on this interaction in class. Look up, right? For example, look up a lot about Argyris and Schön's work. Look further into single loop, double loop learning, right? We may not have, well, I wouldn't say that double loop learning is entirely better, but in a way, double loop learning should complement single loop learning, because there are times when we need to look our actions and correct the actions instead of just correcting the assumptions behind the outcome. Okay, so if there's nothing else, let's end our class. Let's adjourn for now. And next week, we'll meet at the same time, and we'll be discussing about situated cognition. So in the meantime, you may want to look at situated cognition, Brown, Duguid, right? So these are some of the names that you may come up in association with situated cognition. All right. So till then, have a good week. See you all next week, same time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Assalamualaikum.